Hi, Misha here, and it's time to do another $5 Patreon requested video. And a lot of them either I'll need Jay's help with or require some range time. But this is one that's a technical question that I can knock out on this rainy day. Matthew M. says that, like a lot of us, he's got projects, and a couple of them are FAL. And he asks, what are the right receivers, the correct receivers, for both a light barrel build and a heavy barrel build? He doesn't give any more info like year or nationality, so I'm going to kind of have to be a little more generic. And sorry, I don't have any really new FALs to show you, so I thought I'd just show them all kind of lined up here. I know my ARs are kind of in the middle of my metrics and inches and whatnot, but just how they're laid out. So yeah, we'll talk about the quote-unquote correct FAL receiver, and, I'll pass along a few FAL building tips that I myself have accumulated over the years, and hopefully answer Matthew M's question. For those of you who don't know, we have a Patreon account linked below. $1 and up, you can participate in Q&As, and generally speaking, just ask us questions at any time. $5 and up, we started this new perk for anyone. You can request a video, and we'll do it. And as we say then, we don't know how long it'll take us to get to it. Looks like we've been averaging about one a month, but that'll probably pick up as summer comes on. And so yeah, this is Matthew's $5 contribution video request, so I'm going to at least give him a lot of minutes. I don't know about quality, that's up to you to decide, but he will get a lot of minutes because it's me talking. If it were Jay, it'd be 5 minutes and succinct and compact, but me, Lord knows it'll be a feature episode. So grab yourself a drink, some chips, and let's get into the FAL, or the FAL as some people call it. Alright, Matthew, first your light barrel question. I put out examples of each of the three major receiver types, styles if you will. There are minor ones that I will mention, although I probably won't show them all. But these are the big ones. So for your light barrel, this is the Type 1. Notice the lightning cuts all the way back. It also has the same lightning cuts on the right side, as well as a lightning cut on the other side of the magwell flange. This was the original receiver type. The FAL was developed in the 1940s. FN first started to show and advertise in 1951, and then it was officially in production in 1953. Several nations, including the US and Britain, ordered prototypes, sometimes thousands of them, for trials. But the first nation to jump on one was Canada in 1954. And then in 1955, several new other nations purchased the FAL, including Israel, Argentina, and Australia, New Zealand, and others were looking at it very heavily. So if you've got an early kit or an Israeli kit, a Type 1 would be right for a gun from the 1950s. And this here is my G1. This is what came after the German border guard guns. The border guard guns would have the tall sights. And the first border guard guns would even have wood handguards, but soon that would get replaced by the metal with the bipod. When they went to the G1, they went to the low sights with the solid ears. They are 3 millimeters lower. This gives several advantages, including not getting banged around as much, especially this popsicle rear sight. And also, it keeps the soldier's head down more compact package. Originally, the border guard guns had a Type B flash rider, which is screwed onto the barrel. But when they went to the G1, they went to this interesting quick detach flash rider. Quite oddly, they have a bayonet lug on them, but they never used them on those things. Early guns would have wood pistol grips and even wood cocking handles. The wood would go to metal on the cocking handle, on the later plastic. Obviously the pistol grip would soon go to plastic. This is the Type C buttstock with the metal ferrule, and it also has the trapdoor. If I can get it with my hand here. Maybe not. Yeah, there we go. For a cleaning kit. Some FALs have it, some don't. So yeah, for a 1950s gun, you'll want a Type 1 receiver. And if you can find it, the best ones really are the forged DSAs like this one here, because pretty much all of your imports are much later. Well, moving on, I have my STG-58 build, actually done by the same person who did the G1. It's also on a DSA. The STG-58 is very similar to the G1. It's certainly based on it. It just came a couple years later. The big difference, it has this Stoll flash hider built on, screwed on. No bayonet lug. Has slightly different handguards and bipod. A little more improved bipod. More synthetic. Now originally the STG would have had a wood buttstock as well, but many of the woods would be replaced by this unique polymer one that doesn't have the hump in the back, and late production ones would as well. This is on a DSA Type 2. You can see this here, hopefully. And that's the difference, that reinforcement. See on this, it's just a straight lightning cut. Here, it's reinforced. They started doing this beginning in 1962, and the Type 2 did not replace the Type 1. It was just an option. The reason they did that, a lot of FALs were intended to be fired semi-auto only. I mean, it is 7.62 NATO 308, so the full auto position, the 20-round mag, is pretty last resort. So, in fact, some nations, like Israel and Britain, restricted their guns to semi-only. But some nations did use them in full auto, especially the FALO light machine gun version, which had a heavier barrel and bipod. And they noticed, once they were getting into the thousands of rounds count, they were either having stretching or cracking back here, stress on the receiver. Because this receiver is actually designed for a shorter, smaller cartridge, originally, and 7.62 NATO 30 caliber light rifles, it was originally known, was kind of shoehorned into the design. And really, while the FAL is perfectly safe with this caliber, it's its maximum that it can do. This is a long, very finely machined receiver. So the Type 1 and Type 2 started being made concurrently. So if your kit is from the 60s, you could use either one. And Austria would use both Type 1 and Type 2. They almost seemed used interchangeably, just, whatever. I don't believe Israel ever used Type 2 though. So if you have an Israeli light barrel kit, probably wouldn't be correct. But actually I think Type 2 is my favorite. Well, beginning in 1973, FN introduced what's probably the most common receiver, the Type 3. It's basically the same forging, just without the lightning cuts, slab side. It was a little heavier, but it was a lot stronger, and it was faster, easier, cheaper to make, especially with 1970s machine technology. The original Type 3s were forged just like the Type 1 and Type 2s, but then around 1977, FN Herstall started making them from very high-grade investment castings. But other nations, like Brazil, or this one here, Argentina, kept on forging their Type 3s. So that's why I say, if you're just looking for a receiver, in a lot of ways, I think the Argentinian FMAP or Brazilian MBEL, just to build with, are better than an original 1980s FN Herstall because they are forged. Not that the FN Herstalls are bad, but FN themselves used to say the Type 2 especially would be good for about 80,000 rounds, and they said that their cast Type 3 was good for at least 40,000, upwards to maybe 60,000 rounds. So even by their own admission, it would wear out quicker, but everything wears out. And if you have a Brazilian or Argentinian kit, both of which are quite common in America, and it's from the 70s or 80s, then a Type 3 would be correct. And if you're wanting an import versus an American machined receiver, you're pretty much going to have to go with the Type 3. Most all the import receivers floating around out there are that, because by the time imports were coming in, late 70s into the 80s and through the 90s, everyone who was still making the FAL was doing the Type 3. Now, interestingly, just because I mentioned the sights, the Argentinian guns kept the tall sights, much like the British guns, up until what they called the Type 4, their designation, their very late production guns. All of these have 21-inch barrels. They weigh about 9.5 pounds. They all have 13 position adjustable gas systems, short stroke, tilting bolt. These two are builds. This is a pre-ban import. So yeah, I hope that helped with your light barrel, because it really just depends on the nation and, more importantly, the era. Now, I will say these are all interchangeable. You could build any of these on any of these receivers. So if you just like a Type 3 or a Type 1, doesn't really matter what's historically correct, they'll all build up equal. And like I said at the beginning, these are all metric. And I've done a video comparing inch and metric, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. For receiver purposes, our main difference is the magwell, specifically the notch cut out at the front for the nipple on the magazine. Metrics have a small half-moon shape, whereas inch have a much larger welded bar. There's also a small difference in the back of the receiver internally, and there's a difference at the front of the charging handle slot. But the thing is, those you can easily modify. I mean, you can easily modify a metric receiver to take inch parts. In fact, quite a few MBELs were done just that way by Century. Now, modifying an inch to take metric parts might be a little more challenging. So what about your heavy barrel question? As to the heavy barrel, this really is the same gun as the FAL, known as the 50.00. Has the same length barrel at 21 inches. It's just a lot heavier. It is a slightly longer gun because it has a longer flash hider or muzzle device, so it can mount its very heavy-duty bipod. They also have reversed carry handles for a better weight balance with the barrel. Different handguards, of course, but then you get to the back, and they tend to be nearly identical to their cousins. This one uses the same stock. This is an Argentinian FAP, which is their copy of the 50.41, which is the synthetic stock. But this is probably what you have. This is an Israeli Makleon, which is their 50.42, which is the Woodstock. And the Woodstock is a little different because they have a flip-up shoulder rest butt plate and no trapdoor. They can also have 700 meter as opposed to 600 meter rear sights. But yeah, most heavy barrel kits in the US are Israeli. So with that, the best fit would be, again, a Type 1 or really a Type 2. I left the Type 2 out because I think an Israeli kit on a Type 2 would just be great. But probably most of them in reality had Type 1 receivers, but yeah, maybe some Type 2s came in. But you can definitely build on a Type 3, even though this is a kit gun. It is technically a pre-ban. These were assembled by Springfield Armory in the 80s using Israeli kits and M-Bell receivers. Like I was saying, by the 80s, everyone was making Type 3s. And that does bring me to a point. Since the Israeli guns were adopted in 1955, they were early pattern. And there are several small differences, for example, with the gas system dimensions. But another difference is the thread pattern for the barrel. So when Springfield Armory assembled these, they had to modify the receiver to take the Israeli barrel. So if you do an Israeli build, you may have to do that unless your receiver was specifically made for an Israeli barrel. The same thing goes for Argentinian builds. There's a small difference in the bottom, at least with some Argentinian kits. A little relief needs to be cut out of a standard metric receiver to let an Argentinian lower work properly. But many manufacturers have done specific Argentinian receivers because they've become so common. Now, if you don't have an Israeli, then about the only other heavy option that's even out in any numbers is the Belgian Pattern. Now, this is an Argentinian gun. If you know my videos, you know it's one of my prides. They produce this under license, and it is very similar to the Belgian version, including this flash hider, the short open-topped handguards for better barrel cooling. It has the earlier wood carry handle. Most of your Belgian imports from the 80s had the newer style plastic, but it does have the polymer buttstock, which most of your Belgians did as well. Another major difference, the bipod on the Argentinian is, okay, the Belgian bipod is sturdy, really sturdy. The Argentinian bipod looks like something off a battleship. It looks like a girder. I don't know how you would bend one. I'm thinking it would probably be a Superman thing. They are extremely overbuilt. They're also very heavy, but overbuilt. And these bipods are quick detachable. Now you'll notice this has this collar, and one screw runs through it to hold the bipod on. Typically when they were getting in vehicles, they would detach them and they would carry the bipod in a belt pouch, which actually I do have. For the Belgian pattern, it's a little different. They actually use a snap ring to hold the bipod on along with the keeper. And while the bipods for heavy barrels are pretty easy to find, it's the hardware that connects it to the flash hider that can be very difficult to find. So if you have a heavy barrel kit, make sure it has all the small bits to attach the bipod. I mean, you can find them, but yeah, they're just hard to find. I think because they wore out and they get lost and so on and so forth. Not near as many countries adopted the FALO, because really it was just a standard FAL that was meant to be used more on select fire with the heavy barrel, and they weren't great. I love them for collecting and shooting semi-auto, but for militaries, it really was just a rifle that was heavier, but still didn't have quick change barrels. So if I was doing a build, if it was more of the Belgian, newer Argentinian, I would go Type 3. If it's an older Israeli, or maybe an older Belgian, maybe you got lucky, I would go Type 1 or 2. In fact, you can see this is a Type 3 compatible lower. These all line up nice and neat. Notice on this gun here, the lower lines up. You can really tell which upper the lower is meant to go with on how it's cut. Now look at this one, Type 3, but then it has the cut back like it would be for a Type 1 or Type 2. Now oddly, the Belgian imports from the 80s, the factory effing guns, were like this as well. I find that interesting at any rate. Another variation in receivers, and this is more for light barrels, are what are often referred to as Type 1.5. And these are South African, Arms Corps, Littleton, what have you, made guns. While they had almost the same lightning cuts as the Type 1, they were a little different. Their shape, the rounding was a little different on them. Meaning that if you try to put an R1 lower on a standard Type 1 upper, they don't quite line up perfectly. Totally a cosmetic thing, something most people wouldn't notice. But if you're going for that ultimate South African build, you will want to get a replica South African upper receiver. And as far as I know, the only ones to have ever done them are DSA and Kunin. Of course, Kunin's gone, and DSA is different today. So, yeah, good luck finding one. I'm just saying, if you see what claims to be a Type 1.5 or a R1 specific upper, that's what they mean. They have the lightning cuts to match the R1 lower. That's just one of the oddballs. Let's talk about a couple of other unique ones, and then we'll wrap things up. Well, just for completeness' sake, if you have an inch pattern kit, much of what I've just said is pretty, stupid cord, is pretty irrelevant. Inch guns, as you would expect, kind of did their own thing. They were built on a variant of the Type 1 receiver with a simplified lightning cut and more squared off in the rear. And just to make things more fun, Britain and Australia did slightly different patterns, as did Canada. Canada's were stripper clip fed, so there was actually an indentation on the left side for your thumb. I don't think you have a Canadian C1 kit, but just saying. Now this is a DSA replica Australian receiver, Lithgow receiver. And this, of course, is a original British Birmingham small arms BSA receiver. It sounds just more rounded and whatnot. The other differences with inch receivers, they have small reliefs in the back for the little wings or tail of the dust cover to rest in to keep it from sliding too far forward. They also have a relief for the folding charging handle. See, it doesn't have an indentation like on a metric. Instead, it locks forward to keep it from reciprocating. Of course, there's lots of differences in an inch kit. But as far as the receiver, you only have those, plus you have the larger relief inside the mag well for the inch magazine. It's pretty easy to cut a standard metric receiver for all of these things, though. This is, again, the Australian L1A1. This is their variant of the Fal. They have the major differences with the handguard / bipod. It also has the L1A1 style flash hider. Late L2s actually had removable sight ears, so if they got damaged, they could easily be replaced. Exposed gas tube for cooling. The God, that annoys me. Yeah. The charging handle, carry handle, excuse me, is still canted backwards, but it is actually offset forwards. You have the rear sight on the dust cover, kind of unique. This is found on the C2, but the later C2A1 went to the big disc. And yeah, there we have that. And finally, the Paratrooper, which at first glance seems to be a standard Type 3, but it has a few different cuts as well. For one, it has the cutout for the handle. Some have this spacer where the carry handle would go. Others, it's just solid here. And another difference, because of how the recoil system is housed up top, the front of the receiver here, where the dust cover, top cover goes in, is actually inletted for the nose of the cover to sit. And so if you get a standard receiver and want to build a Paratrooper kit on it, you can either relieve the receiver to take the nose, which is the proper way, or you could take the nose off of the top cover, which will work, but it'll make dis and reassembly more of a headache. Originally, Paratroopers had a only windage adjustable single aperture rear sight, often called a Holland style. Later they would go to a 2-position flip, which DSA has made a replica of. The heavy barrel and the light barrel both have 21-inch links. The Paratrooper actually comes in 3 links. The 5061 is a 21-inch, just like the standard rifle, so about the only difference is the folding stock. Typically those have a carry handle and a fixed charging handle. The 5062 has an 18-inch barrel, so kind of Congo or carbine length. The 5063 is the shortest. It has a 17.2 inch barrel, so about 3/4 of an inch shorter than the previous one. The reason they did that was so they could easily jump out of airplane doors. And it would be the 63 variant that would most often have the folding handle and not have a carry handle. There was also a 5064, which was the same as a 5061, but it had an aluminum alloy lower receiver to save on weight. Kind of neat. Now these are by no means all of the variants. The FAL was produced in over a dozen countries, at least assembled. At least 70 used them officially, and upwards of 100 unofficially. And approximately 5.5 million were made in total, with about 2 million of those coming from Belgium. And production would last from the 1950s through the 80s, and in some places like Argentina and Brazil, even into the 90s. And some FALs are still in military service today. As far as doing builds, I hope this answered your question about receivers to use, but if it didn't, just let me know and I'll do my best. I will say a few things real quick, and then I'm going to wrap it up. It's always good to have the proper FAL tools, like the butt stock removal tool. Really makes your day a lot faster and easier and safer. Trust me, you don't want to put an eye out. I live that life. You don't want to join me. You also don't want to lose your spring. It's also nice to have the tool to easily adjust the gas regulator. You can do it by hand sometimes, but when it's hot especially, you may not want to. It's also good to have the tool to remove the plug in the back. It's kind of like a bottle cap opener. In fact, a bottle opener will work in a pinch. When you get a US made receiver, they tend to be on the tight side, so expect to have to do some fitting for the mag catch and bolt hold open, because they're trying to make them to be compatible with even well-worn parts, so they undersize it. Just go in and clean it up. Likewise, a lot of times you'll need to clean up the threads in the receiver where the barrel screws in. If you're doing an inch build, headspace is achieved with two things. You have a washer that goes between the barrel and the receiver that times it properly at 12 o'clock. You'll need to get the right thickness washer. It uses a locking shoulder in the back as well. But metric guns, they just use the locking shoulder by itself, which is really sufficient. My personal opinion on locking shoulders, they're inexpensive. I would get the right one that headspaces properly. Some people buy oversized and grind them, file them, sand them to fit. I don't like this. I think you might be doing weird things to the surface heat treat and finishing. And besides, whenever you file and sand, it's so difficult to get it absolutely even. Meaning if there's even the smallest hump, burr, or bulge, your headspace might be getting thrown off. So it's just better to measure for headspace and install the right locking shoulder. And I really like this method of headspacing because if your gun loses headspace through wear, it's a very simple thing to drive out your shoulder and just install a fresh one that restores headspace. It's actually a very simple, ingenious way. And if you have a few shoulders but none of them fit your gun, most places like the FAL files, there's trading boards where people will be willing to trade around because you might have the size someone else needs and someone else probably has the size you need. Just saying. Obviously, when you check for headspace when you're building, you want to remove the extractor. And also, it is a little different to set for 7.62 NATO versus 308 Winchester, but you can read up on that on guides. If you do a build from a full auto kit, there is no need to modify the lower. All of the things that make it semi-auto, like not having the cutout for the battery safety, the auto sear, and having the semi-auto ejector block, that should all be in your upper already. So there's no reason to restrict your lower unless you just want to. Most imports were, for obvious reasons, but most of your kit builds, you can flip the safety all the way over to full, but not much happens except you get hammer follow. But if you want, you can put in a semi-auto only selector. It's easy to do, but it's not required by law. And that is about it, I'd say. If you have any other questions about building, happy to either help, or if I don't know, I'm happy to help you find the answer. I appreciate again, and so does Jay, your $5 donation, Matthew. Hope this was worth it. Please let us know below. And anyone else, if you're interested in ordering a video like this, just check out our link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and also on behalf of Jay, we will catch you very soon next time.